Grey Goo. Well, it does sound like something you'd crack a joke about in primary school. Let's try and keep the comments away from being filled with Grey Goo lol, okay? Please. Grey Goo was developed by Petroglyph Games as their return to classic RTS, after a slew of what could best be described as misfires following the release of their debut title Star Wars Empire at War, and the subsequent Universe at War. Unrelated games, by the way. Everything's just at war with these guys. For some reason, I always thought that Grey Goo was an older game, coming from that late 2000s era of 3D RTS. But as I begun this review, I got a bit of a shock to learn that it came out in 2015, only 6 years ago. It's a game I'd heard a lot about, and had always been tempted to try, especially after seeing the praise it received from both PC Gamer and the late great Total Biscuit. But whether due to its generally middling user reviews, or just a lack of interest from my mates, I never did. But hey, this is my job now, and I can't just endlessly review Command & Conquer and Impossible Creatures until I die. So, it's finally time to play Grey Goo, and ask the simple question: should you play it in 2021? While many RTSs I review here are classics released in the late 90s and early 2000s that are a nostalgia trip to play now, Grey Goo takes the form of a fairly modern game that is trying to be that nostalgia trip in of itself. It's purpose-built and designed to be just like the strategy games of old, taking heavy inspiration from titles many of the developers themselves created, that ended up forming and evolving the very genre they found themselves working in. Grey Goo takes many of the tropes of what modern RTSs employ, like the lack of base building in World and Conflict, the small-scale battles of Iron Harvest, or the turn-based elements of Total War, and says, no, we want base building, we want resource gathering, we want real-time strategy, like our fathers and their fathers have played for generations. And so it was. Grey Goo included 4 asymmetrical factions, with each of them following a similar pattern of available units and buildings, but finding variation in terms of the functionality they provided, and methods that they used to build and expand. Like most RTSs we all know and love, Grey Goo centers around base building. Proper base building. There's a single resource that does everything from construct buildings to adding extra functionality to your array of units. It's reminiscent of Command & Conquer in a lot of ways. By design, I'm sure. Hell, even the resource gatherers are called harvesters. As mentioned, there are 4 factions to choose from: the Beta, the Humans, the Shroud, and the titular Goo. Most of their differences lie in how they build and operate their bases, but within that they do share a lot of fundamentals like building and unit classes, making some of the what seem like on the surface to be diverse factions to be, in reality, not too dissimilar at all. The campaign takes you through a tour of each of them, minus the Shroud, who added in DLC, moving consecutively through as you progress, and you'll see more of each one as you complete more missions and unlock more of what they offer, presumably not to overwhelm you all at once. I get why this is done for the first faction, as everything at that point is completely new, but it did get a little old with the succeeding ones because of how similarly they operate. I would have preferred the flexibility and freedom of having everything unlocked after a few missions, even when changing factions. It makes the campaign feel more like a glorified tutorial for each faction to prepare you for skirmish, rather than a dedicated single-player experience. But what's funny about saying that is that it's completely at odds with how the campaign is presented, which is completely chock full of production value with impressively animated cutscenes, pre-mission briefings, in-game voice acting, and even an interesting story to boot. How about that? It begins with a focus on the Beta, who are the most analogous to being the good guys in our story, though you could make an argument for some of the others by then too. By galactic standards, the Beta are a fairly primitive species, being referred to as such by the humans for still using bullets rather than having fancy lasers or energy weapons. At the onset, humanity actually represents an encroaching force, with the Beta having to fight them, as well as the omnipresent and mysterious Grey Goo. While I won't get into spoilers, as you may want to experience it for yourself, I will say there are a couple of good twists along the way, and the story is actually quite interesting. The characters are fairly likeable, their motivations are solid, and it's presented in a way that makes it easy to understand everyone's unique point of view. And if you read into it, there's actually some pretty interesting lore here too. However, while I do like getting all these different perspectives, it can be quite jarring switching to a new faction throughout the campaign. Because it's entirely chronological, there are points where you'll be victorious over the enemy in one mission, only to be in command of said enemy for the next. It's weird to be suddenly fighting against the faction you've been rooting for hours, and it makes it feel like there's no real end goal or progression to be had. I would personally prefer if the campaigns were split by faction, and be more interwoven rather than one large consecutive story as it is here. But I understand why it's done this way, and again without spoiling anything, it does make sense looking back after seeing it all play out. But aside from those couple of issues, overall it is a great time for those looking for a classic single-player RTS campaign. And once again, shout out to those cutscenes, the quality of which really do elevate everything to another level. They were created by Axis Studios, by the way, whose work you may recognise seeing in other big gaming properties of the last few years. These wouldn't have been cheap to produce, and I commend Petroglyph for undoubtedly allocating a decent chunk of the campaign budget into having them done. It clearly shows their dedication to the single-player experience. Lastly on the campaign, there's also some DLC that was released after the base game, which includes 3 missions, some new cutscenes, as well as filling in a couple of holes in the story that were previously unanswered. And while at launch some called it too expensive for what it offered, at this point in 2021 you'll likely be able to pick it up at a fraction of the price, whether in a bundle with the base game or on its own. As a lot of you likely remember, by the time 2015 rolled around, the classic RTS we all know and love had been squarely relegated to a very niche corner of gaming, as it still is today. Indies were playing their part in keeping the genre alive, and it was becoming rarer and rarer to see bigger budget, classically styled RTSs come to market. But Petroglyph set out to do just that, and even without knowing their history with the genre, you can clearly see how Grey Goo's gameplay roots were firmly planted years ago in Command & Conquer. Despite each of the 4 factions being fairly asymmetrical, there are core elements that persist across all of them to ground their playstyles in a way that makes swapping between them not too much hassle. There's one resource to collect, harvested by building refineries on small deposits across the map. These are limited in capacity, so once they're empty for good. And the game manages this resource in quite an interesting manner. Like CNC, you're limited to how much you can hold at any one time, an amount that's expendable by constructing silos. However, your harvesters will constantly bring in more of it, even if those silos are full, leaving the extra to be wasted. It encourages you to constantly be either expanding your base or your armies, but also means these deposits do tend to deplete rather quickly. And if you don't realise that you're constantly eating into this limited supply, then you might find yourself with empty deposits, an encroaching enemy, and no way to resupply. Base building and expansion are the primary ways factions are differentiated from one another, and working with each one's positives and negatives is one of my favourite parts of the game. They will provide their own challenges which you are forced to overcome. The beta are probably the simplest to understand. Their buildings are built on dedicated nodes off of main hubs, not too dissimilar to how it works in Halo Wars, and you can build more hubs of varying sizes to support more buildings, to build more units, etc, etc. The humans also use nodes, except everything needs to be connected via power columns, which is both comparatively freeing and restrictive at the same time. They do also, however, excel in defense, and their powerful array of turrets makes locking down positions a lot easier than the other factions. The Goo are mobile and don't really build bases like the others. Instead, large masses can be split off into smaller ones that perform different functions or become troops, and to gather resources one only needs to sit said giant masses on one of those deposits. Lastly, the Shroud, who were added in DLC. They can place buildings anywhere, but have a smaller selection which need to be individually upgraded and powered by adjacent spikes to progress down their tech tree. All the available units are unique to each faction, although the classes they fall into are quite similar. Each get a selection of light, heavy and aerial to choose from, as well as one super unit that are easily the most interesting of them all. I say that because apart from them, nearly all of Grey Goo's units are terribly bland, with boring designs and forgettable names. It's got severe planetary annihilation syndrome. The thought of building them does little to get me excited. Gameplay is worse off because of it, and it doesn't help that everything in Grey Goo just takes so long to do. The primary culprit being the time needed to construct buildings and train those units. Each thing needs to occur in basically the same manner every game, with most buildings and units requiring others to be built first. So you start a game and just sit there, wait 30 seconds for your refinery, then another 30 for your factory, 15 to 30 or more for a single unit, you get the idea. And doing all that just to get a bland grey unit out the gate doesn't make for a very exciting loop. I loved Command & Conquer 3 thanks to how quickly you can be up and running, while also having unique, interesting units at your disposal to boot. There is some level of unit alteration to be had through upgrades too, however you can't research everything from all your categories. You pick one and the others are then locked. If you want to change, you need to remove the one you've already picked and then add another. I'd much rather have a fully fleshed out tech tree rather than these admittedly significant but extremely limited options. To be frank, I just couldn't get excited about playing skirmish matches. The thought of running through the same process every time I started, just to slowly build an army of uninteresting units, just wasn't doing it for me. Even with the very solid mechanics Grey Goo does have underpinning it all. I think the game has a bit of a personality problem, though it's not an issue in the campaign thanks to the story holding it up and doing most of the heavy lifting. The graphics are decent, but the art style really isn't anything to write home about, but at least the soundtrack is pretty great, thanks of course to Frank Lebacki. But without the context of the campaign, I just found the general atmosphere and vibe of Grey Goo to be pretty boring, and not very exciting for me. Also, the performance tends to chug when the action gets heavy, which never helps anything. It looks to be linked to limitations in the game engine considering the computer I'm running this on, so this might be a persistent issue for a lot of you out there. I did want to get another opinion on Grey Goo however, so I went to my friend, fellow Southern Hemisphere mate and Grey Goo mega fan at Ricky Summer to see why he loves the game so much. And this is what he had to say.
Hey, how's it going guys? Ricky Summer here, and today I've come back in time to defend Grey Goo with my last dying breath. Alright, listen, I freaking love Grey Goo. As someone who played way too much Command & Conquer 3, Tiberium Wars, Grey Goo felt like a return to form. It felt like the first RTS of that kind to come out in, well, since Command & Conquer 3. And to me, it was a worthy successor to the Kane's Wrath expansion for Command & Conquer 3. I mean, you had the asymmetrical factions that did actually force you to play differently depending on which faction you chose. It made you think differently, which is very cool. The humans were defensive, the goo was aggressive, and the beta was, I mean, I guess kind of somewhere in between. I was always a beta boy. As much as, look, I'm a turtler in RTSs, I admit it. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm a little bit ashamed of it. The beta were my boys. And the tech upgrades gave a little taste, a little glimmer of light customization almost for your chosen faction. I mean, from the moment that you could take your beta scout, which was by default stealthed, and trade in its stealth for the sake of projecting that stealth to your entire army. To me, that was so friggin' cool. I love that. I love that the sense of customization. It made me feel like almost a sense of ownership over the way I played the beta. And the presentation, man, I mean, those cutscenes were beautiful, and at the time they blew me away. Not to mention the music. I mean, it was like a bit of a gritty Marvel-esque affair with 90s Matrix leather-clad undertones. It was beautiful. But listen, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go reinstall Grey Goo. Thank you to Zade for having me in the video.
And thanks to Ricky for lending himself to the video. Here's a link to his channel in the description. Check him out if you're a legend. At this point in the video, we're left in quite a unique position. It's not often I enjoy a strategy campaign, but not its accompanying skirmish mode, but alas, here we are. I think Grey Goo suffers from a few key things that keep it from becoming one of those games that RTS fans will be referencing in conversations years down the line, like they do for Command & Conquer, Rise of Nations, etc. The main one I think is personality. Let's be honest, Grey Goo is a weird name, and its factions and units are generic at best, and when taken at face value, wholly forgettable at worst. There are genuinely interesting aspects about them, but it requires the context, background, and characters of the campaign to bring them to the surface, leaving skirmish and PvP solely relying on mechanics and gameplay systems. And for me, they just aren't interesting enough to fill that void. I do really respect Petroglyph for going this route in 2015 however, and any classically styled RTS is at a base level at least going to get a few points from me. The campaign is a great time, I really enjoyed it. There's great variety with missions, as all the game's factions, and the story and its accompanying cutscenes are intriguing, entertaining, and absolutely worth your time and money. If you're just looking for a good skirmish game however, at least consider what I've said. My issues may be things you care about too. But if all you're after is that classic RTS gameplay with modern stylings and a slick, high production package, then Grey Goo may just be the game for you. Thanks very much for watching. If you like what I do here, consider dropping a like and hitting subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. I'd like to give a special shout out to those who support me via Patreon and YouTube memberships. You too can join the likes of David DeBolly, Chrissy218, T-Edits, Crispy Robo Chicken, Dekayo, and Standby for Systems Nominal, who supports me at the Paladin tier. Thank you very much. As for questions, Standby for Systems Nominal asks, what RTS had your favourite atmosphere/vibe? In his opinion, it's Company of Heroes 1 with its voice acting, music, and UI, and undoubtedly one of his favourites. For me, it's probably something a bit more specific. For some reason, I really vibed with Empire Total War's ship battles specifically. Just something about the weather effects and the way that they were presented were just so cool, and it just really reminded me of like Master and Commander, that kind of thing. Secondarily, maybe actually the original Stronghold, just with the accents and everyone's kind of voice lines and quips, and how when you were getting invaded, your villagers seemed like really nervous and concerned about the enemies that were coming at you. So those would be my two.